Hey, welcome back. Today we're going to continue our journey on the exposure triangle and learning how to use our digital camera. And today we're going to focus on shutter speed. And so shutter speed controls the amount of light that comes into the camera. So the shutter is inside of your camera and it's the little thing that opens and closes. Now today, because we have mirrorless cameras, we actually have two different types of shutters. We have a mechanical shutter, which is a physical thing that opens and closes. And we also have an electronic shutter. And so the electronic shutter is hooked into the sensor, and basically it lets the camera just make an exposure without the mechanical shutter going up and down. So basically it disables it, so it opens the mechanical shutter and you take the picture by just using the electronic shutter. And what that does is it allows you to take faster shutter speeds. But that's not really the goal today. Today, we're trying to explain to you how shutter speed affects your images in photography. So we have learned that everything in photography has two functions. One aspect is controlling that amount of light. So if the shutter opens up very slow, click, it's letting in a lot of light. If it opens and closes quickly, click, click, it lets in less light. So shutter speed controls the amount of light getting into the camera by how fast it opens and closes. So shutter speed is interesting because it comes in a variety of different numbers. We can have full seconds, we can have tenths of a second, hundredths of a second, and thousandths of a second. And so usually shutter speed is written like 1-30. So that's 1/30th of a second. Typically in a digital camera, the slowest shutter speed you can have is bulb. So bulb means when you press your shutter speed down, it stays open. When you let go, it closes. Now, the fastest number that it can record in time itself is usually 30 seconds. So you can hit it, it will stay open for 30 seconds and then close. And it goes all the way up, usually to somewhere like 1/4000th of a second or 1/18,000th of a second. However, that's with that mechanical shutter. If you have a mirrorless camera, you can usually sometimes achieve faster shutter speeds by using the electronic shutter. But today we're just going to be focusing on shutter speed in general, and we're going to assume everything is the mechanical shutter speed. If we take a look at the numbering system for shutter speed, it's kind of in the middle. It's not as easy as ISO because remember, ISO just doubled itself and it made it really easy. I'm going to start at a 30th of a second because otherwise I'm going to have to say way too many numbers and it's going to make it way too complicated for anybody to understand. So remember, we're going in whole stops, even though our camera adjusts in third stops, and those whole stops numbers are 1/130th of a second, 1/60th of a second, 1/25th of a second. Remember that one, that's a crazy one. And then 1/250th of a second, then 1/500th of a second, then 1/1000th of a second, 1/2000th of a second, and 1/4000th of a second. So it was basically doubling, except for when it went from 60 to 125 and made our life complicated. We've got that number that's been thrown in there, makes it a little difficult to understand. Now, there are a couple of shutter speeds that are really important to know. So what shutter speed does is it controls motion in the camera. So what does that mean? Well, it can stop action if you're playing sports, or it can purposely blur action so you kind of have that beautiful, graceful blur in an image. And we use that to control motion. If you want to stop action in the camera, a typical number of 1/500th of a second gets thrown out there. And that is the minimum to stop action. However, that would be like the minimum to stop like walking, something really slow. If you really want to stop action, you really want to be up around 1/1000th of a second. So if you were to ask me, I would say if you want to stop action, the minimum shutter speed is 1/1000th of a second. Now the trick with this is because the shutter speed is so fast, it doesn't let a lot of light into the camera. So you need to get more light from either your aperture or your ISO. So there's always trade-offs when we're trying to set exposures, or what we call equivalent exposures, which we'll get into later, on the camera. So yeah, we want to stop action, but the higher we make that shutter speed, the less light that gets into the camera. And if it's an overcast or a dark day and you're outside, you need that light to be able to achieve that high, fast shutter speed. So we have to get that from somewhere else. Typically, I would tell you if you were out photographing somewhere and you can shoot at 1/2000th of a second or higher, that is going to be better because you're going to get better, sharper images if you're trying to stop action. If you're not trying to stop action, there's a couple of other numbers that we need to take a look at. So we have two theories on this. So this comes into how fast we can take a picture of a non-moving object handheld, meaning we're holding the camera with our hands. How fast can we take a picture of a non-moving object? Original general thumb for that was 1/60th of a second. Now, that doesn't mean that if you take a picture at 1/60th of a second of a non-moving object, you're guaranteed to not have motion blur, because you might have motion blur. That's the minimum. So if you can set your shutter speed higher than 1/60th of a second, like 125, 1/250, 1/500th of a second, that's gonna be better and help eliminate motion blur. Unless you're trying to get motion blur, then that's okay. Now, there's a second way to think about this, and it's probably a more intelligent way to think of this. Your minimum shutter speed to take a handheld picture of a non-moving object is equivalent to your focal length. Focal length is what a lot of people refer to as the zoom. So if your lens is a 75 to 300 millimeter zoom lens, your focal length is somewhere between 75 and 300. That is written in millimeters, and it's always on the very front of your lens. So right now I'm recording on a 50 millimeter lens. So that means that my focal length is 50 millimeters. So how does this work with shutter speed? What it's saying is if I want to take a handheld picture of a non-moving object and not get motion blur, I should be at 1/50th of a second or faster. I would never go below the 60 unless, and there's always an unless, if we take a look at a 100 millimeter lens, this rule applies to it like this. The slowest we should take an image handheld of a non-moving subject is with 1/100th of a second. So you'd never want to go below that 1/100th of a second. That's because the longer the focal length, the slighter movements appear quicker inside of that viewfinder. So as you go up, your minimum shutter speed goes up. I think that's a better rule of thumb, and that's going to save you. Now, lenses today, what we call image stabilization, or Nikon calls it vibration reduction. Basically, it's like a gyroscope or a stabilizer inside of the camera. We also have IBIS, which is a sensor stabilization. And what those allow you to do is sort of shoot a little bit lower than you normally could. So if we were using that general rule of 1/60th of a second to take a handheld picture of a non-moving subject, we might be able to lower that down to a 30th of a second, right? Because we have that image stabilization that helps compensate for some of that handheld movement that we get. Now remember, this is of a non-moving subject. So if you're taking a portrait of somebody, it's not going to really help, because you might not be moving, they might be moving, and that little bit of movement can cause your image to not be very sharp. Let's review that. So if we want to stop or freeze action really about 1/1000th of a second or higher, and if we don't want our image to blur or have motion blur, we really don't want to go below the shutter speed of 1/60th in general, or if we have a longer focal length, we don't want to go below that shutter speed equivalent. So if it's a 200 millimeter lens, we don't want to go below 1/200th of a second. Now, in the case if you're using a tripod, that's going to allow you to do a longer shutter speed of a non-moving object. However, if you want to do a longer exposure of a moving object, it's going to blur, but the blur or that effect might be something that you want inside of photography. So there's always going to be exceptions to the rule. It really depends on the user intent. And what you're going to find out when we look at the exposure triangle, all we're trying to learn is how to control the camera and get the images out of it that we want. So in the case of photography, sometimes you might want an image sharp, sometimes you might purposely want it to blur. It's really all up to the photographer as to what they want. What you need to know is control your camera to get that. Because remember, there's two things in photography. One is the exposure. You have to get the exposure for it to come out. The secondary aspect is you want that image to look. And that's what we're trying to look at here in these secondary aspects of the exposure triangle, or in this case, shutter speed. What does it do? It controls motion. So the one last thing I'd like to touch on here with shutter speed, and we're not going to get into it because it's going to make your life way too complicated, is that if you use a flash with a camera, all cameras have what we call a max sync shutter speed. Means if you put a flash on your camera, or your camera has a built-in flash, the fastest your shutter speed can sync with that flash is a number. And it's usually around 1/60th of a second or 1/200th of a second. What happens if you go over that is you'll start to see black lines or funky things in your photos that don't look normal. Here is my crude diagram of how your shutter works inside of your camera. So first we have the sensor, and the sensor is going to be covered by one of two shutters. So when the shutter is covering the sensor, we can't take a picture. And then the shutter is going to open, and that's going to open to the top. And then the camera is going to gather the light and take the picture. And then the secondary shutter is going to move up and cover the shutter. And that's what it's going to look like when you have a slow shutter speed. However, when you have faster shutter speeds, what happens is the first shutter starts to open, and at the same time, the second shutter starts to move. So at no one time is your sensor completely open to the light. It's like a little slit that moves across your shutter speed. And so this is why when we take a look at shutter sync speeds, we can't sync the camera at high shutter speeds because the sensor is never fully open. We'll get into why that happens later. Now, most cameras today also have what we call high-speed sync, and that allows them to sync at higher sync speeds than typically normal would happen in a camera, especially your older DSLRs or manual film cameras. And the way that happens is the camera actually pulses. So instead of going poof and just having one exposure of light, the camera goes pop, 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 like that. And it keeps that exposure over a longer period of time. Well, that's it for shutter speed in the exposure triangle. Shutter speed controls motion and controls the amount of light that gets into the camera. In the next video, we're going to take a look at aperture, which is going to be the last aspect of the exposure triangle, but there's going to be more videos on equivalent exposures and other aspects of working with all those different settings in conjunction with each other. If you found this video helpful and could give us a thumbs up, that would be great. If you have any comments or questions, you can leave those below. Don't forget to subscribe and have an absolutely wonderful day.